Hi, I'm Bella. I love reading, and my favorite book series of all time is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I've read the series a couple of times, but it has been a little while since my most recent reread, and with a new book in the series coming out next month, I thought now was a really good time to reread all of the books in the series. So, I'm gonna do that. Even though I've read these books several times, I've never written down my thoughts while I read them. I have a lot of thoughts on these books, but I've never annotated my book copies or written down notes while I'm in the middle of reading the books. So my plan for this reread is to be critical and analytical in my reading. Anyways, if you'd like to join me, this is the first video in what will be a series. I'm going to reread The Hunger Games. I will take a pause between each part and share my thoughts, and then also share my thoughts at the very end, share some of my notes, my annotations, and yeah, thanks for joining me. Let's reread The Hunger Games. Okay, I have finished the first section of The Hunger Games, Part 1, The Tributes. So before I get into my thoughts on the first part of this book, I do want to just set expectations for this video and other videos in this series in terms of spoilers. Although I'm not specifically setting out to give you a synopsis of this book, I am going to give you my full thoughts and notes from reading this. So in this video and others in this series, definitely expect full spoilers for the books as I'm reading them. But since I've already read all of the Hunger Games books, I have noticed while rereading this and taking notes that I am often referencing things that happen later in this book or in other books in the series. So I'm gonna do a blanket statement here that this video and the rest of the videos in this series will probably contain Hunger Games spoilers for all of the Hunger Games books that are currently out. I'm saying that are currently out because at the time of recording this, the fifth book in the whole entire series, Sunrise on the Reaping, is not out yet. So no spoilers for that because it doesn't exist yet. Okay, anyways, so yeah, I just wanted to get that out of the way that definitely expect general Hunger Games spoilers while I'm talking about these books. Okay, now let's get into it. So part 1, The Tributes. It's in my copy. It is the first 130 pages of the book. I put a lot of little sticky tabs in it. And basically part 1 follows Katniss from the morning of the reaping to the night of the interview, which I think happens the day before the actual Hunger Games start, but we're not there yet. We're just at the interview. Okay, I'm switching to my iPad where I took a kind of unhinged amount of notes. So in general, most of the notes that I took on part 1 are just about world building and general setup of what to expect in the books and the series. So we learn a lot about our main character Katniss and her backstory, her family, what her drive is. We learn about where she lives, District 12, and we also learn about Panem as a whole. And so we sort of learn a bit about the relationship between the capital, which is the ruling entity and city that makes laws for the whole entire country, and then all of the districts. We also learn about Katniss's best friend Gale. We learn about Katniss's sister Prim. We learn about Peeta. We learn a little bit about Peeta, who's the other tribute from District 12. But yeah, part 1 is a decent amount of world building and then also getting Katniss from District 12 to the capital ready for the games. So like I mentioned, I'm not planning to give a synopsis of everything that happened in part 1, but I did have a couple of core thoughts or themes that I wanted to mention, basically trends that I noticed of stuff that was brought up in part 1 and things that I'm thinking about or have been thinking about while reading part 1. So the first thing that I want to mention is the setup of the districts versus the capital. So in part 1, we learn a lot about what the government of Panem is. So there's the capital, which is painted as one city. We learn a little bit of geography about the capital in that it is in the Rockies, and because of its positioning, like right next to the Rockies, basically the capital is guarded from all of the eastern districts because of the mountains. And we learn that this was really crucial in the uprising that happened 74 years ago, because it was really difficult for rebels in that uprising to get to the capital, because they had to climb over the mountains, which made them an easy target for the capital's like forces. But yeah, so we learn about the capital. That's the government for Panem, and then we learn that it is governing 12 districts, previously 13, currently 12, and that's the structure of Panem. One of the big things that we learn a little bit more about in part one is how the capital like exerts control over the districts, and one main way that it does that is through the Hunger Games. I think particularly through conversations that Katniss has with Gale, we learn that the Hunger Games are really a method of controlling people in the districts. There's conversations about how the districts are forced to provide a tribute to the capital to fight to the death, like as a sacrifice, and there's nothing that they can do about that. And that's a way that the capital like exerts its control. I think also there's another example of a way that the capital like exerts control over the districts that is maybe a little bit more subtle, but I think really important. And that is the mention of the tesserae, which is the system where for poorer people in the districts, they can opt to enter, like poor children who would be in the pool of potential tributes for the Hunger Games. They can opt to enter their name into the pool more times to get tesserae, which is grain and oil, maybe? I forgot. But what's interesting about this is that I see this as another method of control, because it's like Gale describes this as a tool to cause misery and plant hatred between like wealthy people and less wealthy people in the districts. And he says at one point that it's to the capital's advantage to have us divided among ourselves. And I think this is another interesting element of like the capital's control, because it shows that like by having the tributes of the Hunger Games be reaped from the population, but having that be an unfair system that like favors or is worse for poor people, they are making like distrust among citizens in the districts, which theoretically makes a rebellion less likely because there's not like a unified district versus the capital. So interesting like methods of control in the capital. Another theme that I think we're starting to see in part one is all of the ways that Katniss is like being painted as a symbol of the rebellion. I think even before we're anywhere near a rebellion, or like Katniss as a symbol of a rebellion. So like one, I think mentioning early on that Katniss's father died in a mining accident is like motivation for her to hate the capital, which I think is interesting. Also, there's a lot of fire, like she is the girl on fire, and to me, fire inherently feels sort of rebellious. I don't know, like I just feel that's like a good rebel symbol. Also, District 12 doing the like 3-finger salute gesture when she volunteers as a tribute at the reaping, I think is another, like they're sort of treating her as a martyr even though she hasn't died yet. And I think that's sort of like a rebel symbol to me. Also the Mockingjay pin, I think, is a huge one, because Katniss, like as soon as she realizes that it's a Mockingjay, she knows that the Mockingjay is sort of like I think she calls it like a slap in the face to the capital. So like obviously as the series continues, the Mockingjay symbol like really becomes huge, but we're already seeing it in part one. So like we're setting things up. Another like theme that I noticed a lot is the sort of like difference in levels of softness of characters. So we learn a lot about Katniss in part one, particularly like what her motivation is, what her personality is, how she relates to people around her, and like she's a very hard character. She has had to like grow up really fast and be a very like tough, hard person with she is not vulnerable. She has walls up. She is very hard to get to know. And that is like out of necessity in a lot of ways. But then we have like a juxtaposition with her sister Prim, who she specifically tries to shield from the rest of the world so that she can remain soft. I also think PETA is a really good juxtaposition. And like a particular example that stood out to me was when Katniss and Peeta, at the end of the reaping, they're getting onto the train to go to the capital, and Katniss specifically is like, I don't want anyone to see me cry. I need to look tough and hard, and like no one can see me vulnerable. And then she sees Peeta, and he very obviously has been crying, and he's like not ashamed to show that. And I think it's an interesting like juxtaposition. And then there's also like there's Gale, who I think is very clearly another hard character like Katniss. They are tough. They're very similar. But yeah, I think it's interesting seeing these like different levels of like hard versus soft in characters. Another thing that I think is really cool when you pick up on it in part 1 of the book is there is so much food. There are tons and tons of descriptions of food. We like basically one of the first few moments in the book is Katniss finding a little goat cheese that is left from Prim, and then meeting Gale in the woods, and he has a loaf of bread. They talk extensively about hunting and like hunting and gathering food for their families. There is the like really critical moment where Katniss gets help from Peeta in the form of food, bread. And then almost every single meal that Katniss has in the capital is described to us, the reader, in detail. We hear all about the different stews, the food, the hot chocolate, how Peeta is like dipping his bread in hot chocolate. There's so much food description. And I think like it makes sense. It's the Hunger Games, and it's also a really great way to show the difference between District 12 and the capital. But also, I think what is so interesting about hearing so much food talk is that because this book is written in first person, we are inside of Katniss's head. It shows, like it sets up how, like what her priorities are and what is important to her and what she as a character notices. And I just think it's really cool when you start like picking up on it, like, oh, Katniss is thinking so much about all of this food, and therefore we as a reader, like we see that because she's talking about it so much. I don't know, I just think that's cool and like clever. I also think that part 1 really sets up how the Hunger Games are a tool for entertainment for the capital. Particularly, like, there is mention of a previous Hunger Games where the arena was very cold and there was no wood to build fires, and it was boring because everyone just froze to death, and that was so boring for the capital citizens. Also, the scores, which sort of remind me of like sports betting, like odds, which feel just like clearly a tool for entertainment. I know that the scores are also tied to sponsors, but I think like it's a tool for entertainment as well. Also, the interviews where the tributes are forced to like sell themselves as like interesting people and show off their personality or whatever, like it just reminds me so much of like a beauty pageant almost, where like these people have to like go up and share parts of their lives. And like particularly with Katniss, she is forced to share an incredibly vulnerable moment and relationship, her relationship with Prim, for everyone's entertainment. Also, that is my cat running around, so if you hear that, sorry. uh, Also, I think the training feeds into this as well, where my assumption is that the only reason that the training, like the tributes have to train for a few days, is so that they gain some amount of skills, so that the games are more exciting and the tributes are more likely to fight instead of just like die of freezing. And then the last thing that I kept thinking about while reading part 1, and that I'm really keeping in my brain while I go into part 2, is this idea of like, when does each person start playing the game? So I think we see all these moments with Katniss where it feels like she has been playing the game, and the game meaning like the Hunger Games and this game of control with the capital versus the districts, etc. It feels like Katniss has been playing this game like ever since her father died and she was forced to be the provider for her household. She has like this really clear understanding of control from the capital. And like she notices these moments of like she feels like she owes Peeta something because he saved her life. And like there are these moments of like trading control that I feel like are her playing this larger game of control. And I think Haymitch also has a really deep understanding of this game. And it's like he's been playing it ever since, you know, he was in the Hunger Games. Whereas a character like Peeta, it's not, I'm curious to know like when does the game start for him, because I think we see these genuine interactions with him like at the reaping and even on the train, but then in the interview, like he knows going into the interview that he's going to talk about having like a crush on Katniss, and I think we know that he has decided this ahead of time because he tells Haymitch. And that to me feels like playing a game. Like you wouldn't reveal that just for fun. Like that is, there's an intentional choice there. And I think the choice is to like give some power to Katniss by making her seem more desirable. But like that's a choice. That's playing a game. And like I think there are all these different characters who are in on this game, and I am so curious about like when does the game start for them? What are they playing? What is their goal? And then thinking even broader beyond this book, so like spoilers for the rest of the series, we know that a lot of these characters end up being part of this like rebel organization and plot. And I'm so curious reading part one, who is a rebel already? Like when do these things start? And it's possible that some of that like timeline is revealed in the later books and I don't remember because it's been a while since I've read them, but I can't stop myself from thinking like, who's a rebel? What are the games that they're playing? Who is already playing a game? What are the motivations? Like, I don't know. Anyways, that's the thought that I'm taking into part two, which I'm gonna read now. So thanks for hanging out. I finished filming my whole like spiel for part one, and then I remembered that I had some random notes that I specifically wanted to mention. First of all, the first time that I cried in this reread is when the baker comes to see Katniss after the reaping before they go to the Capitol, and he's like, I'll make sure Prim doesn't starve. I cried. Also, the cookies, when Katniss tosses the cookies off of the train and they land in the dandelion patch, I almost cried that time. I didn't, but it was real close. Also, Haymitch not showing any interest until they start showing that they might win is like also heartbreaking. Another moment that I specifically took note of is when Katniss and Cinna are sitting down to a meal, and Katniss has this whole like inner monologue of like, all of this food would take me days of hunting and trading and I still wouldn't even be able to make like a comparable meal. And she says something along the lines of like, what do folks in the capital do instead of spending time on finding food? Like, what would I do with my time if I didn't have to use it finding food? Something about that feels like it is directed at the reader. And I think that's interesting. Like, I think there are all these moments in this book where Suzanne Collins is like, hey, reader, think about this. And I think that's one of them. Another moment that I specifically took note of is when Katniss and Peeta are in the chariot and she like starts getting into it with the like she's excited about the waving and like she's playing this part, and I think that that is like proof of her understanding, like having this understanding of the game that is going on, because this is the first time that she's seeing that like playing into the game works, and she's like, oh, got it, I'm in. I just think that's interesting. See you for part two. I finished part two, the games. Let's talk about it. So part two starts out the night before the Hunger Games, the night of the like tribute interviews, right after Peeta's big reveal of like, I don't have any special girl at home because my crush came here with me, which is very dramatic. And then we go from that moment into getting into the arena, the start of the games, all the way through the moment when there is an announcement that there's been a rule change, and now there can be 2 victors instead of 1, as long as the tributes are from the same district. So the first couple of days in the arena. Part 2 is really interesting because we're seeing for the first time like the actual violence of the games, like firsthand. Up until now, we have heard about how horrific the games are, and we have seen the way that tributes are treated leading up to the games. We've also heard a lot of like games history in general like through dialogue and everything, but it's our first time actually being in the games. So it's violent and it's rough. I once again took a lot of notes. Yeah. So I have a couple of major thoughts and slash or themes that I wanted to talk about again. First of all, birds. I wrote birds. So there's a theme that I feel like I started seeing in part 2 that was about birds, and birds were not mentioned for the first time in part 2, but I guess it's more of like a continuation of birds as a thing that exists. I don't know, stick with me. So we already had this theme around the Mockingjay, particularly the Mockingjay being like a sort of slap in the face to the Capitol because it's a like it was an unintended result of capital like of a capital weapon. So the Mockingjay is not new. It's also like literally on the cover of the book. It's Katniss's pin, her like token for her district. It's not a new thing, but there's more birds. So first of all, when Katniss is in the hover car being taken to the arena, she specifically sort of compares herself to a bird. She says that she feels like she's flying like a bird, but the difference is that a bird is free. So that was like an interesting bird moment. Also, when she is kind of like making her way through the arena on, I believe, the first day, she mentions not enjoying going downhill because she wants to be up high, like in the hills of District 12. And while that's not specifically, like, that doesn't specifically say bird, I think it's bird adjacent. So I think that's interesting. There's like more connections of Katniss as bird. And then also we have the really important moment with Rue and the Mockingjays, where Katniss sort of learns more about the Mockingjays, and also Rue and Katniss form a connection and an allyship specifically because Rue notices Katniss's Mockingjay pin and like feels connected to her. So birds, Mockingjay specific, but like birds as a theme. Also, I think like birds is an interesting thing to think about because the idea of like birds flying, I think, invokes a strong sense of freedom in general. So, like, playing with that sense of, like, is Katniss like a bird that is free and flying, or is Katniss like a bird that's in a cage? I just think that's, like, an interesting thing to think about. The next thing I wanted to talk about is PETA, which I guess is not like a theme, but there's more PETA in this section. So it's sort of interesting that the book is written entirely in first person. We only have Katniss's perspective, so we don't know what's happening with other tributes like PETA while we're going through the games. We only know what's happening with Katniss, but we get a lot more glimpses of PETA and what he's doing in the games. So also, like, not just in the games, but even before the games start, we're getting more PETA. So they have that whole conversation up on the roof the night before the games. I think it's the night before the games, where he talks about not wanting to be a piece in the games. And I think this is like a crucial piece of PETA's personality and also just like a thing to think about this whole entire book. Like, what does it mean to be a piece in the games? Like, who is playing with whom and for what? Like, what are the games? What is a piece in the games? Anyways, there's that moment. And then also, like, the very first moment in the games, PETA is looking out for Katniss. So we see them, or read, the moment that the games are about to start, they're all on their pedestals, and Katniss is having that moment of, like, maybe I should go into the cornucopia and try to get some weapons. And she sees PETA, who is specifically looking at her and shaking his head like, no, don't do that. And I think that's interesting because in this first moment of the games, when probably all the tributes are thinking about themselves and what their strategy is going to be and figuring out, like, what does the arena look like? What do I have access to? What am I going to do? PETA is looking at Katniss. I just think that's interesting. It makes sense. It's on brand, but it's interesting. Anyways, then PETA joins the careers, and Katniss figures this out, I think maybe even on like the first or possibly second night. I think the first. Katniss figures this out very early in the games because she sees, or at least hears them together. And at first, Katniss is like surprised by this, but like even, and this is, I'm pointing this out because I didn't remember this from having read this book previously. Even that, like, within that first few moments of Katniss realizing that PETA is with the careers, she thinks about the fact that, like, this could be a strategy for him. And she talks about how, like, it might, like, there's some sort of angle that he's playing, even though she doesn't know what it is yet. And she also thinks about the fact that because she overhears a conversation with the careers without PETA, where they're saying like, oh, should we just get rid of PETA? And then another one says like, no, we need him to help find Katniss. And so Katniss thinks about how like PETA knows all her secrets in a sense, like in terms of this situation. Katniss's biggest like secret or piece of leverage in these games is that she's great with a bow and arrow, and no one knows that except PETA. PETA does know that. And so he could really sabotage her by revealing that information to the careers, but Katniss infers based on this conversation that they don't know that yet. And I think it's interesting because when I have read this previously, I sort of thought that Katniss immediately is like, that traitor, he sold me out, he's with the careers, he's like all in with them. But I don't really think she completely buys that even from the beginning, which is just cool. Anyways, also PETA saves Katniss after the Tracker Jackers, which is like, and he specifically puts himself in danger because the careers see him do that and know that he has betrayed them. So that's interesting. And also, Rue mentions that she didn't think that PETA's whole like love story thing was an act. And having read this story already, like I know where we're going with all of this, but I just think that's interesting. Like why does she believe it? What does Katniss think? Why is Rue thinking about this? What do other people think? Like, I think it's obvious that people at the Capitol believe it because they're probably very like excited for a love story. But like, I think Katniss has thought about what Gale would think and if Gale would believe it. And so, I don't know, it's interesting to hear other people believing it or not. Anyways. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is Katniss as a killer and how getting a weapon completely changes her attitude and her approach to the games. Around the time that she's losing her ally, she has her first direct kill, and she later reflects on like why that kill is weighing on her so heavily, and it's because she says like it's the first time that she knew her actions would result in someone's death. Anyways, in part 2, Katniss is officially a killer. She has killed another human. And it's really interesting. Like, one, it's interesting the way that first direct kill happens because it is reactionary. She's not thinking about it. She just shoots and kills someone as a result of them killing her ally. So it happens really fast, but then she reflects on it a few times and she talks specifically. There's one time where she is reflecting on it and she is thinking about that kill and thinking about a conversation that she had with Gale earlier before the games, obviously, where Gale says something like, how different could it be? And she says like, in execution, it's exactly the same, but in aftermath, it's completely different. And she talks about how the person that she killed has a family who is now going to mourn them and like might have had a girlfriend who really thought they were going to come home. And it's interesting that like while she, like when she performed that kill, she wasn't thinking about any of that because it was so fast. But then afterwards, she has to contend with all of these things that make this kill so different than any time that she's killed an animal when she's hunting. Anyways, I feel like I was not very concise in this, but we officially see Katniss become a killer, and that is a really interesting shift in dynamic and attitude. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is packages from sponsors and the way that they carry messages, or at least the way that they carry messages for Katniss. So we see 3 different instances of Katniss either getting or not getting like a package from a sponsor and that meaning something, I think. So the first instance is when Katniss in the first few days of the Hunger Games hasn't seen water anywhere and she's like really struggling from dehydration. She describes her symptoms of dehydration and like it's bad. It's rough. But she's not getting a package of water. And even like since it's early on in the games, she knows that it wouldn't be horrendously expensive. And she suspects, based on her impressive costume and her impressive score from like the training session, that she probably would have sponsors. And she infers that because she's not getting sponsors, like Haymitch doesn't want her dead, so it probably means that she's close to water, and so he's withholding because she doesn't need it. And I think that's super interesting that like this is there's like this example of Katniss and Haymitch as similar people, I think, because of the way they think. And so Haymitch is able to like communicate with Katniss in the games through these sponsor packages, and because like they're thinking similarly. Anyways, that's just interesting to note, and I really liked the way that Katniss sort of figured that out. Then Katniss does get a sponsor package of medicine. She gets burn medicine after she's burned from the fire that is like caused by the game makers. And I think it's particularly interesting, and I might be reading into this, maybe, but I think it's interesting the timing of her getting that medicine. So she gets the medicine once she's like settled in her tree, and then she goes up and starts sawing the branch with the tracker jacker's nest. And partly it could be that the timing is just that like this is the first time that she's settled down in like one specific spot since the fire. But I think it also could be that Haymitch is sort of saying like good job with the tracker jacker nest. I don't know. I think it's interesting timing. Then after Rue dies, Katniss gets a package containing bread that she recognizes is from District 11. And it's interesting, she recognizes this because PETA previously like explained all the different bread to her, which I just think is an interesting source of information. Anyways, she gets a package, it's bread, and this is not really a message from Haymitch of like, good job or do something else or whatever, but it's a message from District 11, and it's particularly important because Katniss like mentions maybe never hearing of a district tribute getting a gift from sponsors from another district. So it's interesting because it's like cross district, which is rare and probably not very like, and is probably frowned upon. But it's also particularly interesting because she recognizes based on what the gift is that it probably is from not like capital people wanting to support her, but from District 11 citizens who probably pooled together a huge amount of money to support Rue. And then when Rue dies, instead of like just saying, never mind, let's not send the gift, they send it to her, which means that District 11 like sees Katniss's actions as like supportive and like I think it's a big deal. I don't think I'm explaining it well, but I think that's a big deal. I think it was a really like powerful moment. And that brings me to the next sort of like theme that I wanted to talk about, which is instances of slaps in the face to the Capitol or like moments of kind of like playing the Capitol. And I think there are a lot of them. So first of all, before the games, we have PETA's I don't want to be a piece in their games comment, which is not an instance of a slap in the face to the Capitol, I think, but it sets us up to notice those moments and to be thinking about the games and the way that people participate in the games as like, how are they participating? And what are the moments where they choose not to participate or push back against these like rules of the games? I think that the packages as messages entirely is a slap in the face at the Capitol because the sponsor packages are not meant to be messages in the game. They're meant to like help the players and basically be a way for Capitol citizens to almost like bet on the tributes that they want to win, I think. But I do not think that they're meant to be used as messages. And Haymitch and then also the people of District 11 essentially use sponsor packages as messages, which I think because it is not the way that the Capitol intends for that to be used is a slap in the face. Also, there's an interesting situation that happens where so Katniss is like basically pursued by fire created by the game makers. She knows because of like the way that the fire is behaving that it is unnatural and made by the game makers. And that's part of the games. That all makes sense. However, I think unintended but interesting after effect of that is that the smoke from the fire subdues the tracker jackers, which is what makes Katniss's play where she saws the branch, the tracker jackers fall and attack possible. I think that would not be possible if the fire and smoke hadn't happened. And that's an interesting one because like that's the fire was to hurt Katniss, and incidentally the smoke helps her and allows her to use this like weapon as a tool for her. I don't know if I'm explaining that properly, but I think that because the fire was specifically meant to hurt Katniss, but the smoke becomes an advantage to her, which is not what the Capitol intended, and I think that's a really interesting moment. I also think that Rue and Katniss forming an alliance is like a little bit a slap in the face or like playing the Capitol. I think it's not ever explicitly stated that only careers form alliances. Like, I think, and from knowing other things about this book series, I know that there are examples of non-career tributes forming alliances, but it seems way less common. And so Rue and Katniss, who are both like small and maybe not the biggest contenders in the game, forming an alliance is an interesting moment. Also, Rue and Katniss using the Mockingjay singing to like pass messages between the two, I think is another slap in the face of the Capitol. Also, one that was particularly interesting is the way that the careers use the mines from the tribute pedestals as a booby trap. And I think this one's particularly interesting because it doesn't come from Katniss or from any of the kind of lower end districts. It comes from a boy in District 3. And I don't think District 3 produces like career tributes, but I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think they do. But it just felt particularly interesting to see someone from District 3 participating in this like subversion of the games. So I think the mine, like Katniss mentions never having seen the mines used as like a booby trap. And that's what happens. So the boy from District 3 works with the careers to dig up the mines from the pedestals and then put them around the careers like food supply to create like landmines so that if anyone comes close, they'll be blown up. But yeah, like because that is not what the mines are intended for, it's another instance of like using the capital game in a way that is not intended, which I think is a slap in the face. I think that was interesting. I think even Katniss calls this out as a slap in the face to the Capitol because it's like using a weapon that they didn't intend to be a weapon. So, and then I think the biggest slap in the face to the Capitol in part 2 is when after Rue is killed, Katniss basically has like a small funeral for her. And I think, and like Katniss has this moment where she wants to force the viewers of the Hunger Games to see this tribute, this victim, this martyr, Rue, as who she is, which is like a young girl, like a human being. And she does this by, after she's killed, she places flowers all around her hair and like on her body and says, like Katniss says as she's doing this, that she suspects that the games won't show footage of her setting this up, but they have to show footage of picking Rue's body up. And so the flowers will be seen and people will know that she did it. And I think it's a big moment because it's like Katniss knows what she's doing. She's specifically trying to send a message to the Capitol about the atrocity that they are doing in the games. And I think that's big. But I think it's also a bigger message, not just to the Capitol. I think it's also a message to all of the districts that, like, particularly because Katniss and Rue are from different districts, they can still care about one another. And, like, even in death and even in the arena, while is still a threat on Katniss, she still makes time to mourn Rue. I don't know. I think that one's a big one because in the arena, all of the tributes are supposed to be, like, it's a fight to the death. They're all supposed to be against one another, but they form this deep bond and allyship. And, like, Katniss forces everyone to see Rue as a human and not just a human, but a child. And then there are two, like, events that I wanted to talk about that happen in part 2. And one of them is Rue's death. So this is, I think, the like most heartbreaking moment in part 2. It is the saddest death. It is the death that Katniss is most closely connected to for a lot of different reasons. Rue, like from the moment that Katniss meets Rue, Katniss sees her little sister Prim in Rue. They're both 12 years old. They're both small. And so, like, Katniss has this bond to Rue just inherently. But then they form an allyship in the games out of both being, like, survivors. They have a lot of commonalities in terms of like not getting enough food, having to kind of like take care of themselves and their families. Like Katniss hunts to feed her family and Rue forages. So they have a lot of commonalities. They become friends. They start to share their stories with one another. And then Rue dies. So Rue is killed by the boy from District 1, while Katniss and Rue, like at the tail end of Katniss and Rue having this whole scheme to destroy the career's food supply, they're trying to meet back up, and Rue is caught in a net that is, we assume, set by the District 1 boy, and then he throws a spear at Rue and she dies. And this all happens like right in front of Katniss. Katniss is just getting to Rue trapped in the net when the spear is thrown. So it's like right there, right in her face. This is also when Katniss then has her first direct kill. As soon as the spear hits Rue, Katniss turns around and kills the District 1 boy. She shoots an arrow into his neck and he dies like immediately. So this is, I think, maybe the most significant moment in part 2 for a lot of reasons. It's really like visceral and emotional for Katniss and also for the reader. But also, I think this is the moment that like radicalizes Katniss. This really changes her perspective on the game, her participation in the game, her willingness to kill. Like after this I mean, she has her first direct kill, and then after this happens, she's like, okay, I'm ready to kill everybody. I'll kill everyone, basically. Also, though, before that kind of like tough, radicalized response happens, we also see a really soft side of Katniss that, other than at home with Prim, we have never seen. Like, she's never shown this in public. So Katniss and Rue have a conversation where Katniss promises Rue she will win, which is a step up from the promise that she makes to Prim before the games, where she promises Prim that she will try to win, I think. So like now both Prim and Rue, she has promised to like try to win these games. So I think she's gonna. Also, Katniss sings, and I don't think we have, I mean, she talks about not really singing after her father passed. So I think it's a significant moment that she's singing, like, regardless of the circumstance. Also, the song that she sings is a lullaby that is specifically connected to her district, and I think that's like really touching. And then also she openly cries. Katniss starts crying while she is singing to Rue. And after having so many instances of Katniss saying things like, I will not let these people see me cry, I am not showing any emotion, like I want the audience to see me as tough, I don't want to show any emotion or vulnerability, like she's crying. She's just openly crying. And I think that's significant. Like she's brought to tears and doesn't hide them. And I think like probably a lot of it is just that she's like openly, honestly mourning someone that she saw as a little sister. But it's like, I don't know, it's a really touching moment. And also I cried. So Katniss has this moment of being like really soft, of taking care of Rue. Then she puts flowers around Rue to sort of like hold the Capitol accountable and to show people that this is just a little girl that has been killed so violently for what? And then I think as she's doing that is when she starts to really have these like, you know, F it, like total, like it's when her thoughts really change to being like ready to participate in the games in order to avenge Rue and to like put a stop to all of this. I don't know. It's hard to like describe exactly what her feelings are, but like she's pissed and she's like ready to go for it. And then the other moment that I wanted to mention from part 2 is the like literal very last moment in part 2 where the game makers announce that there has been a rule change, and now instead of only one victor of the games, there can be 2 if the victors are from the same district, and they're the last 2 remaining. And in the book, basically, like, I think this is super interesting, and I just, like, What's interesting about the book is that we only have Katniss's perspective. We don't know what anyone else is thinking or doing. We have no idea what's going on in the capital. We have no idea what's going on with Haymitch. Like, we only live inside of Katniss's brain for these books, so we have no idea why this rule change happened. But I cannot help but like wonder, why the hell does this happen? Like, whose idea is this? And I'm thinking a lot about how like people of the capital seemed to be like really interested in and excited about the possibility of a love story with Katniss and Peeta. So I could see the people of the capital being excited about that. I think in the movie they actually like answer this question by showing a little vignette of, I think, Haymitch talking to the head game maker, trying to like convince him to change the rule. And then I think he also gets flack for that with the president, but that's like movie lore, so it's not necessarily like part of the book. But I don't know, like, why? Why would they do that? And also, like, just why? No, just why? I'm just curious. I want to know who made that decision and why. I'm just curious about it. Anyways, that's all the like themes that I wanted to talk about. I had two more instances of crying while reading part 2. The first is when Rue asks Katniss to sing. That made me cry. Like, I don't know. The other moment that made me cry on this reread is when Katniss gets the bread delivered from District 11. Yeah, that made me cry a lot. So 2 more cries, which means my grand total of times cried in this book is so far at 3. And then random things from my notes that I wanted to point out. There's a quote from Katniss around the whole like fire moment right after she's been hurt by the fireball, where she says, maybe showing up stark naked in that chariot would have been safer for me. Sort of implying or thinking about how being presented as the girl on fire like made this happen to her. And I think it's just interesting. I feel like there's so many instances in this book of like something happening to Katniss that makes some other thing happen to Katniss. And there's a lot of stuff that's like happening to Katniss. And like, obviously Katniss has a lot of agency in her own story. Like, she is an active participant in her story, but there are a lot of moments where like she is not in control of what's happening to her and she is a piece in someone else's game. And I think that's interesting. There's also a moment where Katniss is talking about how the tributes that have been well fed are actually at a disadvantage in the games because they don't know how to be hungry. And I think that is interesting. I think, like, once again, in part 2, there's a lot of focus on food. I talked about food already after reading part 1. There's more food talk in part 2. Who's surprised? It's the Hunger Games. But I think it's interesting, this reflection on, like, how having been fed more is seen as an advantage. Like, having access to food is an advantage, right? Because like you are like the tributes can be bigger and stronger because they have been fed enough their whole lives, but they don't have this like, I don't know, like raw ability to figure out how to survive that Katniss does. And that like being hungry is obviously a challenge in the Hunger Games, but knowing how to deal with that and knowing how to get your own food and like manage your hunger is like an advantage, and I think it's interesting. I also wanted to point out the time that Katniss and Rue are talking about mockingjays in the arena. And like Rue says that there are mockingjays in the arena, and Katniss is like, what? And Rue is like, yeah, they're everywhere. Haven't you noticed? And I think it's super interesting, this conversation, because like Katniss is really observant. Like, she is a hunter. She knows what's like, she can spot her prey in the woods, and like she's really good at noticing. Like, there's a moment earlier where she hears a twig snap and it's Rue, and she like, I don't know, there's all these moments of her being very observant, but she has missed this like big thing, which is all these mockingjays flying around. And like maybe that's just because like she didn't notice or she was in a different part of the arena or whatever. But I think it's interesting. I see this as like Katniss being really observant of threats, where Rue notices like nice things as well. And I just thought that was like an interesting moment of their different observations. That is all of my notes and thoughts on part 2. Yeah. Now it's time for part 3. I finished The Hunger Games. We've got a different camera and microphone setup than what I've been using for the rest of this video because it's nighttime and it's dark. So I'm at my computer where I stream from, so I have a really bright light, which is very handy. I've been recording these in daytime and just using like natural lighting, but I didn't want to wait until tomorrow to record this, so hello. No surprise at all, I took a ton of notes again. Part 3 starts right after the announcement from Claudius Templesmith, I think that's his name, that there's a rule change and now there can be two victors of the Hunger Games if they're the last two tributes alive and they're from the same district. It goes through the end of the book where Peeta and Katniss both together win the 74th Hunger Games, and then they have like their after the games interviews and reunion and all that jazz, and then they go home to District 12. So this part covers like the second half of the Hunger Games where Katniss and Peeta team up and like Katniss takes care of Peeta, and then also it covers them winning the Hunger Games, and like we get, I think it's not clear exactly the timeline, but we get a couple of days after the Hunger Games, and that's it. Like I've done for the other parts of the book, I have some notes on like major thoughts or themes that I have for this part. So I'm going to talk about those. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is Peeta as a killer. I think in the last section I talked about like Katniss as a killer and Katniss becoming a killer. And so for this one, I wanted to talk about like Peeta becoming a killer. So I think technically, possibly, like, I don't know if we ever get like an itemized list essentially of everyone who Peeta has killed, but from what I remember in the book, there's really only like 2 kills of Peeta's that I can recall. The first one is when he's with the careers and they run into, or I guess seek out a girl, I don't remember from what district, but she lights a bonfire late at night, and so there's like obvious smoke, and the careers go to kill her, but she's not completely dead, and then Peeta goes back and finishes her off. And then in part 3, Peeta has his second kill, which is when he accidentally kills Foxface by giving her, well, I guess not giving her, but by picking poison berries that she steals. So technically part 3 is not Peeta's first kill, but I think like it's when he thinks about having killed someone. Anyways, I think what's interesting about Peeta becoming a killer or like being a killer in these games is that it's different for him than it is for Katniss, in that I don't really see Peeta as having any like direct kills, where like Katniss describes her first like direct with a bow and arrow kill as the first time that she knew her actions would lead to someone's death. And I feel like neither of Peeta's kills really are that. The first kill, like, which I don't even know if I guess technically it would be considered his kill, but like, is it his kill? The first kill that is maybe Peeta's is like a mercy killing. And I feel like he's only doing that because of an action that the rest of the careers did. And also it's not totally clear who, maybe that would be his kill because he like finished her off, but I don't even know if I would consider that his. And then the time when he kills Foxface, it's not on purpose. He has no idea he's done it. It was absolutely not on purpose. Like, the only reason Foxface even dies is because Peeta was picking berries that he intended to eat. So not only was he like not trying to poison her, like he wasn't trying to hurt anybody. Anyways, I'm talking about this in part 3 because of Foxface's death, where Peeta has to sort of like confront that his actions were responsible for someone's death, even if it was not on purpose. But I think it's interesting comparing Peeta becoming a killer to Katniss becoming a killer, because Katniss loses her innocence. Like, she, on purpose, knowing what she's doing, kills someone. And that never really happens for Peeta. So even though he's a victor, even though he like makes it to the end and survives through all of this violence, I think he like stays pure in a way that Katniss doesn't, even though maybe you would still consider him a killer. I just think that's interesting to compare. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is Thresh, the boy tribute from District 11, which is the same district that Rue is from. And basically in part 3, Thresh spares Katniss because he finds out that Katniss allied with Rue, and he spares Katniss as a way of like getting even, and says like, now nothing is owed. And I think that's super interesting because it reminds Katniss of how she feels like she owes Peeta because Peeta like saved her life. And like, even though Katniss didn't save Rue, she protected Rue, and Thresh like knows that and feels like he owes Katniss, and that he like balances the scales when he spares Katniss. And I think that's interesting because these two characters are from different districts. They like don't know each other, but they also like very much both feel this same feeling of like owing someone for having done something that was like to protect you or to protect your loved ones or people that are important to you. I don't know. I just think it's an interesting shared experience. Also, Katniss is talking to Peeta about Thresh, and she says something along the lines of like, I think that you would have liked Thresh. I think we would have been friends back in District 12. And even though it's a brief conversation, it's like an important part of this book and the games where like these people, all of the tributes do not get a chance to know one another or understand one another, or like they are thrown into this arena as pawns and expected to just like kill one another with no thought. And it's this moment of like, these are real people, and if we had a chance to get to know them, we would probably like them. And even though like we don't know a ton about Thresh, it's interesting to have Katniss feel like a really strong connection to him. And it's interesting to have this moment of like, oh yeah, these are real people. I just, even though it's a small conversation, I think it's a big thing. And then I also wanted to talk about Cato, the boy tribute from District 2, because I feel like, I think, so Cato is like definitely, certainly a really important character in this book. He is the last tribute other than Peeta and Katniss to like, he's the last tribute alive other than Peeta and Katniss. He's the last tribute to die. And he's also from the beginning kind of like the biggest threat to Katniss. And I think basically he reads to me as an important symbol, like because he is kind of Katniss's number one enemy in the arena. But I feel like I'm not 100% sure exactly what he symbolizes. I think if anything, he sort of symbolizes the Capitol in the arena, but like he also doesn't. And also the Capitol is in the arena, so the Capitol doesn't exactly need a symbol in the arena. But I think Cato is particularly interesting because like he is most aligned with the Capitol, and he still dies horrifically. Like he has advantage and privilege and access and is favored and is strong, and he still is like totally screwed by the Capitol. So I don't know exactly what the symbol is, or like when I feel like I'm so close to figuring out what Cato means, but I'm not 100% sure exactly what the lesson is, but I think he's a really interesting character. Okay. There's a line in the book that's like, wasn't he always the one to kill? And I think that's the thing that makes me like, Cato is a symbol. Like he's the most important tribute to Katniss. And I think my read is just that like he's the closest to the Capitol of all of the tributes, but yeah. I think what is most interesting to me about Cato is that even though like he's favored to win, he's a career, he's from District 2, which is like pretty aligned with the Capitol as far as we understand. His death is super horrific, and it's like it doesn't have to be, but it is for entertainment. So like Cato's last moments are an entire night, like a full night of being slowly killed by the like wolf mutation animals that the game makers / Capitol release into the arena and that the game makers control. And the reason that it takes them so long to kill Cato is that he's wearing this full body armor, so it's prolonged. They can only like hurt his face, basically. It's like really a gross image. But like you would think that and like Katniss thinks that the game makers could end his life quicker than they do, but they keep it going for so long because it is entertaining and because all of the audience is like on the edge of their seat, like having to watch. And I think this is most interesting because even Cato, a career tribute from District 2 who is aligned with aligned with the Capitol, is still a piece in these games and is still mistreated by the Capitol. And anyways, his death is like really horrific, and even like that, the night of him slowly dying, Katniss describes as like the worst moments of her life, which is big knowing her backstory. His death just like really sticks with me. And like Cato was a vicious killer the entire duration of the games, but it's still like he was still a kid. I don't know. It really sticks with me. It's a really rough thing. Related to Cato's death, I wanted to talk a little bit about the wolf mutations that the game makers put into the arena at the very end, and in general, the Capitol's control in the arena. So the wolf mutations at the very end that like have the likeness of the tributes, that's horrifying. Just in general. That's like such a horrifying part of the game. Like I think that if anything in this book would give me nightmares, it would be that. But bigger than that is how even when Katniss and like any of the tributes are deep in the woods and they feel super far away from the Capitol, they are still so close to the Capitol because the Capitol can control every single part of these games. And we see that throughout the entire, like all of the games. It's not just in part 3, but I think with the wolf mutts and also the Capitol drying the river and making the night super cold to like end the games on their terms, on their time frame, we really are reminded how like even though we're out in the woods, we're not. We're like the Capitol is controlling everything. And I think that is interesting. And then I also wanted to revisit a thing that I mentioned, I think after part 2, which is all of the instances of the whole like a slap in the face to the Capitol. And obviously the berries at the very end of the game are the biggest example of that. And they get Katniss into big trouble. Every time I revisit that very end scene where Katniss and Peeta threaten to like die together by ingesting poison berries instead of having to pick which one of them lives and goes home as the victor, like dang, they really did that. Like even in the way that scene is written, where Katniss is like, wait, do they have to have a victor? Like, do they need their victor? Like we have some control here. Like we can take this control here. Like it's a slap in the face to the Capitol. I think on this reread in particular, it's been very interesting to see all of the like slap in the face to the Capitol moments earlier in the book leading up to that moment. Okay, and then the last thing in part 3 that I wanted to talk about a little bit is the romance between Katniss and Peeta. So in part 3, we spend a lot of time just Katniss and Peeta. There's a whole lot of time with Katniss and Peeta in this cave while Peeta is like really sick and Katniss is trying to help him recover. And in that time, they like talk to each other, they get to know each other a little bit better. And also Katniss does a lot of acting in order to sell this story of these like star-crossed lovers. I think from the very beginning of the book, Katniss has made it really clear that she's like not really interested in romance with anyone at all. So even all the way in like part 1, she mentions that she's like not romantically interested in Gale. And I think she says it with the context of like, she's not interested in having a family. So like, why would she be romantically interested in him? And I think in part 3, like, Katniss to me seems like she is not at all romantically interested in Peeta. And not because like she doesn't like him, but it feels like she doesn't even have the space to determine if she likes him because she's just trying to survive. And Peeta, on the other hand, I think really does like Katniss. Like, I think we're led to believe that everything that he's saying is not made up. And I think it's interesting and a bit confusing because a thing that I think about a lot is that like there has to be some amount of performance with Peeta because like he and Haymitch, like he discusses with Haymitch all the way in like part 1 saying that he has a crush on Katniss in the interviews before the games start. Like that, like why would he do that if not for some sort of like strategy and advantage? But also I think that he says that because he means it. But like he can have a crush on her or like her, but also use that as like a strategy in the game. But like, I think that for Peeta, it's maybe like 95% true and 5% strategy. And for Katniss, it's like 100% strategy, but only because, or at least partly because she doesn't even give herself the like space to consider if she likes him. Part 3 is really interesting because we have a lot of these like really touching romantic moments between the two of them, and we're not inside Peeta's head, so we don't know exactly what he's thinking, but like particularly the moment that I mentioned earlier where Peeta talks about the first time that he knew he had a crush on Katniss when she sang, and like in the moment with that story, Katniss is like, I thought we're just acting, but like all of his details were actually correct. Like you get the sense that he means it. And she's like, wait, what? Isn't this just a strategy? And at the very, very end, like the final chapter of the book, they've won, they're victors. Like in my sappiest read of this is that these two people like could have been a couple and could have loved each other and found each other. And now at this moment, at least, Katniss will never, and Peeta will never ever know what might have happened if not for the Capitol's intervention through the Hunger Games. Like their relationship will forever be tied to this act that, you know, Katniss at least did in survival. But like, I don't know. It's just, I think I just get caught up in moments that are like, none of this would have happened if, and this is one of those like, none of this would have happened if, and it's kind of sad. Anyways, Katniss also says, I did what it took to stay alive, which I think like that's her whole entire take on this. She put herself through this like emotionally very confusing situation because she felt like she had to keep them alive, and she did. And then she also says, I'll never be able to afford the kind of love that leads to a family, to children. And I think that's an interesting take that I want to think about as I continue on through the series of like why she thinks that and what she means by that. Because she says it a few times in this book. And I'm just interested to see how that develops. I know that I read the series before, but I feel like there are certain things that I like didn't think about while reading these books, and now I want to focus on more. Anyways, those are all of the big thoughts or themes that I wanted to talk about from part 3. I also cried one more time in part 3. I cried when Thresh and Katniss are having the conversation at the cornucopia, and Katniss says that she buried Rue in flowers and sang her to sleep. And yeah, that phrasing really got me. And then here are some random specific moments that I wanted to point out from my notes. In chapter 19, Katniss and Peeta get a pot of broth delivered from Haymitch right after they kiss once. And Katniss has her moment of realization of like one kiss equals one pot of broth. And she talks about thinking about love, and she talks about the type of love that her parents had and the way that her mom almost stopped living when her dad died. And ouch. And then it's also interesting to think about that compared with moments later where Katniss thinks that Peeta is going to die and like thinks about how she can't carry on. And I'm not saying they're in love. Like, I don't think that. But I just think it's interesting that Katniss specifically mentions her mom not being able to go on when her dad died, and then her like having those instincts about Peeta. I'm just saying it's interesting. Also, I really love the story about how Katniss gets Prim's goat, Lady. I think the goat's name is Lady. I hope that's true. I just really enjoyed having a District 12 anecdote that involved a few additional characters like the goat man and the butcher Ruba. And I just really liked that little vignette of like life in District 12. I don't know. I just enjoyed it. Also, Katniss kind of cries a lot in part 3, which I think is interesting. It's interesting to see her change in the games where like in a lot of ways the games make her much harder, but in some other ways they make her more vulnerable. Even though she doesn't want to, she kind of is like forced to show her emotions more because it's really tough. There's also a moment in chapter 22 where Peeta is describing the other side of the arena having all of these tall grasses and that being where Thresh was like hiding. And he talks about how they seem really ominous and scary and like they might be hiding all these dangers. And Katniss thinks about how it reminds her of the warnings that the Capitol says about the woods outside of District 12 and how they're full of dangers and everyone should keep out. But in reality, they're also full of food and like opportunity. And I think that's a really interesting moment. Also in chapter 22, Katniss talks about how she feels safe in Peeta's arms and that she hasn't felt safe like that since her dad died. And again, I'm not saying that Katniss loves Peeta, but I do think that's interesting. Also, there is a conversation in chapter 23 where Katniss and Peeta talk about how they sort of like have some sympathy for Haymitch and his need to like be drunk all the time because every single tribute that he has mentored has died. And so every single year he has to come back to the Capitol, mentor 2 tributes and watch them die. And they talk about how like that would be horrifying. Also in chapter 23, Peeta reveals that almost everything that his family eats is stale. They don't get the like fresh baked goods at the bakery. They have to eat the stale stuff. And Katniss sort of compares that to the diet that her family has and how like Katniss, even though they don't have food as consistently, all of the food that they eat is very fresh. She even says something like, it's so fresh you have to make sure that it's not gonna like crawl off the table or something. Versus Peeta, who has more access to food, who has never like not had food, but all of the food that he eats is stale, which is kind of depressing. And I think that's an interesting comparison. In chapter 24, Peeta and Katniss talk about Foxface and how she was probably the smartest of all of the tributes, and how if Peeta and Katniss had been intentionally setting a trap for her, they probably wouldn't have been able to kill her. But the only reason that she died is that Peeta was like genuinely planning to eat those berries. So it's like Peeta's ignorance is what led her to die. And if they had tried to kill her, she would have gotten away. And I think that's interesting. And then in chapter 27, Peeta and Katniss are watching a recap of the games, and it's talked about as like a love story. And Peeta and Katniss's love is really centered in the story of the games. And so the recap is alternating between like moments of their love story, of them like being romantic and all of this stuff, and moments of all of the other tributes dying. And I think that's interesting and really rough. Anyways, those are all of my extra notes from part 3. I'm gonna go to bed now. I finished The Hunger Games, book 1 in the series, last night, and like I've done with all of the individual parts as I've read them, I just have a couple of like overall thoughts on the book. As I've mentioned, this is not my first time reading this book, so I already knew that I liked this book. My reread was great. What was particularly interesting about this reread is it was my first time like annotating my book. I didn't actually write in my book, but I put all these sticky notes and I wrote notes on my iPad. And because I have never read it this closely, I definitely noticed details in this reread that I just hadn't really picked up on previously. So it was really fun to, like, I feel like I'm really familiar with this story, but I still found new things, which was really cool. This is like a near perfect book to me, so it's always really fun to revisit it. So, first of all, I'm thinking a lot about the transformation of characters in the book. And really, there are only 2 characters that I think we see undergo a large transformation and who we follow from the very beginning of the book to the very end, and that's Katniss and Peeta. And it's interesting, like, I think undoubtedly they have both been completely changed by the Hunger Games, but I think that the change that they undergo is a little different. I know previously I talked about seeing Katniss as a hard character in the book and Peeta as a softer character, which also there's a moment in part 3 where Katniss calls Peeta soft, and I just thought that was funny that like I was thinking that and also Katniss is thinking that. Anyways, I think Peeta's transformation involves a lot of like hardening. I think the Hunger Games made Peeta like tougher and harder. Like physically, I think he is tougher and harder in that he lives through these really, really tough injuries, but survives and is literally like made tougher because of that. But also emotionally, like there's a moment at some point in part 3 when Katniss and Peeta find out that Thresh is dead, and Peeta says something along the lines of, like, I'm glad that Cato killed him because now we don't have to. And I think that's, like, pretty harsh for him and pretty different than the way that he speaks in the book leading up to that. On the other hand, I think Katniss goes into the Hunger Games already super tough and super, like, hardened to the world, and the Hunger Games break her. I don't really see Katniss as getting softer from the Hunger Games, but I think she gets maybe, I don't know, just broken, damaged. It's interesting, at the very beginning of the book, we see Katniss be like so reluctant to show any emotion, and by the end of the book, she is crying multiple times. And I think in that sense, she is just like emotionally broken. Some of her walls and her toughness is just like broken from the game. But also, we see Peeta kind of help her emotionally open up a little bit. And I think part of that, like she's playing an act, she's playing at this romance, which is just an act to her. But I think also there's like a real sense of vulnerability that she finds. Um, yeah. And then also, there's a moment at the very end of the book where she catches her reflection when she's like after she's pulled out of the arena and she's in the hover car going back to the Capitol, where she catches her reflection and she describes herself as like looking feral. And I think she goes through this transformation where she starts as someone who's very like tough and hard and in control of herself and her life. And turns into someone who is wild and out of control and like broken. Another thing that I'm thinking about a lot is the control that the Capitol has, both in the arena and outside of the arena. And I think, like, you know, from the very start of the book, we know that the Capitol is like deeply in control of all of the citizens of Panem. We see tributes who are children from all of the districts being forced to play the Hunger Games. But I think like the level of control that the Capitol has is really just enhanced throughout the book, because we see like, okay, the Capitol forces kids to play the Hunger Games, but then in the Hunger Games, the Capitol is controlling every little detail of what is playing out. Like the Capitol controls the fire that hurts Katniss, the Capitol drains the river that Katniss and Peeta are kind of sheltering near, and also controls the temperature. Like every aspect of the arena is controlled by the Capitol. And then after leaving the arena, Katniss has this moment of reflection of how she realizes that like the threat is not over, and she still has to kind of follow what the Capitol wants. And she says something along the lines of like, at least in the arena, the worst thing that they could do is kill me. But now, if I don't play along with what they want, the Capitol can hurt my family, my mother and Prim, my best friend Gail, and all of the citizens of District 12. And she realized like just how much the Capitol still has total control of her life. And I think this is one that I'm thinking about a lot, because I know, because I've already read these books, that we're gonna get to explore that even more going into the next books in the series. So yeah, just interesting, and I'm excited to think more about that. Another thing that I'm thinking about after finishing the book is different levels of privilege and access that people in Panem have. The comparison of privilege of citizens of the Capitol versus citizens in the districts, but also the comparison of privilege of citizens in the like better districts, or the districts that are closer to the Capitol, where they produce career tributes and where they have more, like just more proximity to the Capitol's power, versus districts like District 12 that are kind of furthest away from the Capitol. But even within one district, the difference in privilege and access for citizens that are in the seam versus citizens that are in like the merchant class in District 12, how like Katniss and other seam folks like don't have enough food and are starving to death, but people in the merchant class like don't experience that. And so it kind of colors the way that they interpret the Capitol. And like, you know, Katniss and Gale have this deep mistrust of the Capitol, but I think Peeta still is not a fan of the Capitol. I can't imagine that anyone in District 12 is a fan of the Capitol. But like a moment that illustrated it really well was when Peeta talks about the like grassy fields in the arena looking dangerous, and like they have all these scary animals, and that reminding Katniss of the warnings that the Capitol gives about the woods outside of District 12. I think there's a lot of interesting comparisons of like who has privilege, who has access, and that privilege can come in the forms of food. Like food is a huge, you know, compare it like metric to compare. Like citizens of the Capitol have more than enough to eat. They can press a button and immediately have food show up, versus citizens of District 12 who are starving to death. Anyways, I think that it's really interesting to consider like where the privilege and power is throughout all of Panem. And then, of course, another thing that I cannot help but think throughout this book is what is rebellion? What does rebellion look like? And what are the acts of rebellion? I think as I've been reading this book, I've pointed out a lot of those acts of rebellion, and in a lot of cases I've called them those like slaps in the face of the Capitol, but like those are all acts of rebellion. And it is interesting to see where those are coming from and who is committing those acts of rebellion. And yeah, I know that we're going to see more acts of rebellion in the rest of the books, and I'm sort of looking forward to comparing the acts of rebellion in book 1 versus the acts of rebellion throughout the series. Anyways, those are all my thoughts after finishing my reread of The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. I know I yapped a ton in this video. I had a lot of thoughts to share, but I would love to hear in the comments if you like agreed or maybe disagreed with any of the thoughts that I had reading this, or if you had any thoughts that stood out when you read this book that are different from what stood out to me. I think that's like a really cool thing about reading, is that books can hit us all really differently and we can notice different things. So I would love to know if you noticed something different. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope this was enjoyable, and I'm excited to read the next book. So if you'd like to hear my thoughts on book 2 in the series Catching Fire, stay tuned for my next video. That'll probably happen next week. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. See you around. Happy reading. Also, I think I said this when I did my part 3 recap, but I cried 4 times while reading this book. I suspect I'll cry more in book 2, but it'll be fun to find out. Wish me luck.